Welcome, this is Jenn, the Liberty Lion. This is the journal. I'm not sure what house this is, the Senate or a House of Representatives. It's page 8, December 6, 1869. This is entitled Legal State Government, National Debt. So this is what that's talking about, the legal and illegal state governments, the national debt, and the fact that the United States conspired to take over the independent states and bring them in under their control. And the purpose was because the independent states were actually supposed to control the federal government. When the independent states control the federal government, it's easy for the independent states to end the federal government. And they didn't want that. Of course, power does not want to end or allow anyone to end it. So I'm just going to read some of what this says, and I will post it, and you can go through and read the rest of it. If you want more of this document, you can simply take a piece of it, like the blessings and countless others are entrusted in your care, such and such, and Google it. And a lot of times the document will come up. So it says, emerging from a rebellion of gigantic magnitude, aided as it was by the sympathies and assistance of nations with which we were at peace, 11 states of the Union were, 4 years ago, left without legal state governments. A national debt had been contracted. American commerce was almost driven from the seas. The industry of one half of the country had been taken from the control of the capitalist and placed where all labor rightfully belongs, in the keeping of the laborer. The work of restoring state governments loyal to the Union, of protecting and fostering free labor and providing means for paying the interest on the public debt, has received ample attention from Congress. Although your efforts have not met with the success in all particulars that might have been desired, yet, on the whole, they have been more than successful than could have been reasonably anticipated. 7 states which passed ordinances of secession have been fully restored to their places in the Union. The 8th, Georgia, had held an election at which she ratified her Constitution, Republican in form, elected a governor, members of Congress, a state legislature, and all other officers required. The governor was duly installed, and the legislature met and performed all the acts then required of them by the Reconstruction Acts of Congress. Subsequently, however, in violation of the Constitution which they had ratified, as since decided by the Supreme Court of the state, they unseated the colored members of the legislature and admitted to seats some members who were disqualified by the 3rd clause of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, an article which they themselves had contributed to ratify. Under these circumstances, I would submit to you whether it would not be wise, without delay, to enact a law authorizing the governor of Georgia to convene the members originally elected to the legislature, requiring each member to take the oath prescribed by the Reconstruction Acts, and none to be admitted who are inalienable under the 3rd clause of the 14th Amendment. Now, the basic problem, the most basic fundamental problem we have here is that there are people who are saying state includes all states, and that all states are exactly the same. But this is not the case. You had states, which here he calls nations, and the assistance of nations or other states with which we were at peace. So like the North, the states in the North. That's how I read it. If he meant something else, he didn't clarify that. He didn't make it clear. So these independent states joined the Union, and they elected their own military officers into the Union. But then once the Union was created, they didn't want those states to have their independence. They wanted them to be under the control of the federal government. And so they make up all of these lies and they misconstrue the intention of the Constitution by saying things that the states are all the same. All the states are under federal control, that the federal government created the states, and that the states did not create the federal government. So when the states tried to leave the federal government had a right to deny their secession, their new constitutions, and to forcefully using the military to bring them back in under the federal government. But that's not actually the case as far as what the founders intended to ever happen. What the founders seem to have envisioned was that the independent states would remain free, sovereign, and independent, and that they would control the federal government. That the federal government was created for military purposes to defend the independent states. But the federal government created dependent states and placed those states inside the independent states. And those are the military forts, arsenals, dockyards, in other words, defense posts. So the state legislators, the independent state legislators, would choose the people to go onto the federal lands. And they were still state citizens, but also then federal citizens. So not everyone became a federal citizen or citizen of the United States or United States citizen. The state citizens were state citizens when they were in the independent state. And the federal citizens were still state citizens, but also federal citizens when they moved onto the federal lands and became commissioned officers. Once they became commissioned officers, they were entitled to run for election and sit at the seat of government. Because you have a military government and you have a civil government. The civil government appears to have been the states, the independent states, and the federal government and the dependent states are the military government, the federal government. The federal government or the military is under the control of the independent states. So you can see why the military wanted to take over the independent states, because they want to be in control of the independent states instead of the independent states being in control of them. So during the Civil War, they used slavery as their method of manipulation and their justification for going to war and taking over the independent states. So the northern states agreed, the southern states seceded, and the federal government used force to take over the independent states and put their military officers into the positions of the legislators. And this is why we have some people in Congress saying that they took a legal state government, called it illegal, took it over by force, and then called it legal again. And then they wondered why it was deemed illegal in the first place and made legal when they had done nothing wrong. But the reason why was because the federal government wanted to use the military to take control of the independent states. That way, they could make them all the people appear as federal citizens to which they could control. They could tax and they could force them into labor positions within the corporations, because by now the federal government had already been taken over by corporations. So the federal government had been taken over by corporations, and we know this from the book Rockefeller Medicine Men, has a great example of how Rockefeller used his money and his position to take over and bribe the Congress people. And this was something that had been going on for a while, probably since the 1840s or 1850s. So the corporations took over the federal government, and use the federal government to use the military to take over the independent states so that they could get control of the independent state governments, all the resources and the people, because of course we know that humans are our energy, we are labor, we work and we create things and we do all the things that they don't want us to do. They can institute things such as the wage, the minimum wage, to where they can keep labor cheap, keep prices high, keep their profits high, and then they create these wealthy people. They create trusts. They instituted a president or a Congress who will change the laws for trust estates, allowing them to have their trust renewed, because their trusts are renewed every 100 years. So they allow their trust to be renewed under these new, more lenient tax laws for trusts, and they renew their trust, and then the next election cycle, it's business as usual. So every 100 years, they have to renew their trust. The wealthy people have to renew their trust. And when they do this, they just institute a president who will pass the law, make sure the law is passed and written in, allowing them for the renewal under very lenient trust laws, which was what Trump did. So they don't have to pay for the president every term. They only have to get him to do it once every 100 years. So the corporations took over the federal government. They used the federal government in those positions to take over the military, and used the military to take over the independent states, at which point all of the resources and all of the people were under control, basically, of the corporations. So this is a paper on the national debt and legal state government. So if you want to read this whole paper, again, just take a section of this and Google it, and it should come up. It's Journal of the probably Congress, December 6, 1869. It starts on page 8. This is just a section that I chose to address. The whole paper would probably be good to read and very informative. Please consider liking, sharing, subscribing, and leaving a comment, and I will check you guys out in the next video.